All right, I am introducing you guys to a new character, Leo Frobenius. He has not been translated into English except for a handful of not very important works on just African art, nothing featuring any of his theoretical observations or his cultural or morphological procedures, which are exactly the same as Spengler's. And indeed, he was kind of a rival of Spengler's. He was born 7 years ahead of Spengler, and that matters in astrology. I looked at their charts, and we'll be looking at their charts. I think I have them up here somewhere. Double check if they're on my desktop. Yeah, they're there. So we'll look at their charts, and we'll look at their karmic connections, because it's crazy. And so he was an ethnologist, a rebel, and an outsider, like Spengler was. Like everyone in this group that I admire is. If you're not a rebel, probably there's something wrong with you. You might be missing a pair or something of that sort. And Paideuma. So what is Paideuma? What does that mean? Frobenius claims that he's taken it from the Greek language, but I looked it up online, could not find it in the Greek language. But it is connected to the word for pedagogy, which means instruction and learning and knowledge. But that's not really what he means by Paideuma. Paideuma is his word for what would be in Spengler equivalent to both his idea of Dasein on the one hand and symbols on the other. Paideuma is a culturally creative force that moves through human beings to effectuate culture forms. So human beings do not create Paideuma. Paideuma creates human culture through the efficient cause of human effort. And so it's sort of an intelligent, spooky kind of energy. And each folk has a different, Heidegger would say each people has a different Dasein. And whereas for Spengler, there's only one Dasein. That's the cosmic pulse, beat, rhythm, instincts of the universe, and so forth that pulses through the sex organs and through the circulation of the blood and the heartbeat. There's only one Dasein for Spengler. But Heidegger says that each civilization has a different Dasein, which is his equivalent to saying each one has a different symbol. And Frobenius will say the same thing. Each culture has a different Paideuma that is its essence, its signature, its whatness, and so forth. So with that out of the way, okay, I have translated this book out of the German completely. I've completely got it finished. Let me step back here. And there the guy is, rather dashing looking. And indeed, as it turns out, he is pretty much the real life version of Indiana Jones. And I'm pretty sure George Lucas modeled Indiana Jones off of him because Frobenius is just as great and important a thinker for Joseph Campbell as was Jung and Oswald Spengler. He would be the third most important in that group. And in The Mass of God, he mentions Frobenius quite a bit, specifically, particularly in the first volume, Primitive Mythology, because Frobenius, his area of expertise was finding the symbols in what then was called primitive cultural forms, or what we would say today, indigenous peoples, mostly in Africa, but all over the world. But Africa was his area of expertise, and he went on a bunch of different excavations and journeys and so forth, digging up African art and sending it to Germany and putting it in museums, exactly like Indiana Jones does. Same thing. And he looks very dashing here. Probably an extrovert, exactly the opposite temperament to Spengler. So when Decline of the West Volume 1 came out, that was 1918. Frobenius read it, and this book was his response to it. This book was published in 1921, and this is his version of a sort of cultural indigenous version of Decline of the West. It's only 125 pages, and his prose reads, as we'll see in a moment, reads very smoothly and clearly. He's easy to understand, unlike Spengler, who you have to kind of wrestle with, sort of like Heidegger. Not so with Frobenius. He's not shallow at all. In fact, his whole method, as we'll see, is based on the opposite of the mechanistic scientific way of approaching culture forms, just purely analytically. He doesn't do that. He groks the culture forms. He understands their essence. And so I've changed his subtitle a little bit, an outline for the study of culture forms from within. He uses the word Seelenlehre, which is sort of soul teaching, literally. There's no real English equivalent for it. But what he means is studying culture forms from within, grasping their essence and their symbols, their Paideuma, in other words. Okay, and I'm doing a commentary to this, so it's only 125 pages, and I've already finished the translation. This is the first complete book now that I've translated into English, and it's never been translated into English. I've paused work on Spengler's Fragen, the primordial questions, because I wanted to get a feel for this guy. Because what happened is that Frobenius was the direct result of this book and Frobenius' work in general, because they played a little ping pong game. After he wrote Paideuma in 1921 and published it, remember Decline of the West Volume 2 doesn't come out until 1924, Spengler picks this up, reads it, and is blown away. Oh, here's another guy that totally independently and unaware of each other, even though they were born, Spengler was born in the Blankenberg, the Harz Mountains, and Frobenius was born in Berlin. They were on parallel tracks. They were both applying Goethe's morphological intuitive method to the study of culture forms, which is a very rare thing, as he says here, as we'll see in the introduction. So I've got a commentary that I've done where you'll get notes in the back of the book that you won't get anywhere else from anyone else. I can guarantee that. Academe has canceled all of these guys, Joseph Campbell, Frobenius, Spengler, and it's impoverished itself as a result. It's pathetic. Academe really is pathetic. It's an institution that should be ashamed of itself, basically. And, okay, so let's zoom in a little bit so I can read this better. So I put over here, I've retained the imprint, publication by the Research Institute for Cultural Morphology, which is not, of course, it's publications by me in my press, Iconic Books. But I like the archaism of it, of leaving it there. And then he says here, I regard teachers as the appointed guardians and nurturers of the seeds of all cultural and spiritual life. Excellent. Then he's got a quote, an interesting quote from Goethe. I've added this second one because it really does need to be here, where he has from Goethe, even if the world as a whole progresses, young people must always start from scratch and experience the epochs of world culture as individuals. This is going to be a sort of thesis of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny type of thing. The human individual goes through the exact same morphological phases as does each society and each of the high civilizations, the Hochkulturen, that were the domain of Spengler's morphological method, whereas Frobenius does the same exact approach for indigenous and aboriginal peoples. Goethe inherited this distinction from Immanuel Kant, the distinction between Vernunft and Verstand. Vernunft, the reason, and I'll just read it here, he defines it perfectly. The reason, Vernunft, is conserved to strive toward the divine only through the becoming and the living, and the understanding, Verstand, only to make use of the become and the dead. The understanding is what scientists use they use mere concepts, whereas Wissenskünstlers, you might say, knowledge artists, such as Spengler, Frobenius, Jung, and all these guys, Steiner, they're knowledge artists. They make use of reason, which makes use of ideas with a capital I, not mere concepts. Concepts are just shells that are left over from world-creating Platonic forms and earth symbols and so forth. All right, here's the table of contents. And then my introduction will go here, so I've left that blank. I'm still working on putting the book together and going through it, rereading it, polishing it up, and okay. So here's his foreword. Mechanistic versus intuitive research. I'll skip the first couple of paragraphs. They just describe his getting stung by an academic when he was in his 20s. This book was written when he was 38 years old, or at least published when he was 38 years old, which is important for those of you who know astrology. That's when Uranus opposes Uranus. It's 40 years. It takes 84 years to go around the sun, and at 40 years, give or take, it's halfway. Uranus is the planet of breakthroughs. And he wrote this book on his Uranus opposite Uranus. Spengler wrote The Decline of the West, published it at age 40 also. Okay, I'm going to have to bring this in a little closer here. And let's see. All right. With all the passion of a young soul, I now immersed myself in my work. However, at first my peace was disturbed. I think he was in his mid-20s at this point that he's describing. All objectivity shaken, the excitement so great that it could only be expressed in grasping the whole. All the notes that had been made up to that point for future work from literature and museum observations were sifted through. I had developed the firm resolve to place objectivity above personality as the sole deciding factor. the realization of the necessity for a completely new order of the enormous material became increasingly apparent. The idea of a large institution arose in my mind, in which all source references, well ordered, structured by inner meaning, and protected from human weakness by a solid framework, a stone home, as it were, for the essence of human development, would be stored up for the history of culture. The first boxes were ordered from a local carpenter, and then cardboard boxes, and neatly prepared inserts from a bookbinder. All right, let me skip that paragraph and get over here. An inner upheaval in the fall of 1894, he was born in 1873, 7 years before Spengler, who was born in 1880. So he's about 20, 21 here. An inner upheaval in the fall of 1894 had given rise to the Africa Archive and a sketchy theory of the organic uniqueness of cultures. This came to wider public attention with the work The Imagination of Cultural Style, and after completion of the initial preparatory work during the years 1897 to 99 with the publications in Petermann's Bulletin, The Origin of African Culture, and Natural Scientific Cultural Studies. Its basis, which has since found wider application as the theory of cultural circles, Kulturkreislehre, assumes that culture should be understood as an independent organism in relation to its human carriers, that each form of culture should be regarded as a living being in its own right, experiencing birth, childhood, adulthood, and old age. Cultural forms are subject to their own growth processes, which correspond to the developmental stages of the human individual. They behave clumsily and awkwardly in their youth, energetically and purposely in adulthood, and childishly in old age, etc., etc. Above all, it is not the will of humans that produces cultures, but rather culture that lives on humans. Today, I would say it lives through humans. Culture is bound in its forms to certain areas, the culture circles. The forms are transformed when transplanted and produce new forms when combined. And so as you're reading, when you see a footnote, that means it'll be one of my endnotes. The few footnotes that he has in this book, I think he only has 2 or 3 of them, are just literal footnotes at the bottom of the page. So you would see that number 1 there, and then go to the back of the book. And so far I've only written 2 notes. I was working on one today, an exchange of letters between Frobenius and Spengler that are rather comical. So the idea is defined by Joseph Campbell in the following way. In 1898, Leo Frobenius announced a new approach to the study of primitive cultures, the Kulturkreislehre, culture area theory, wherein he identified a primitive cultural continuum extending from equatorial West Africa eastward, through India and Indonesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia across the Pacific to equatorial America and the northwest coast. This was a radical challenge to the older parallel development or psychological schools of interpretation such as Brinton, Bastian, Tyler, and Fraser had represented, inasmuch as it brought the broad and bold theory of a primitive transoceanic diffusion to bear upon the question of the distribution of so-called universal themes. So that's from Primitive Mythology, page 15 in the Viking edition. And then I add, so this is my comment, this idea that Frobenius invented was later adapted and re-territorialized by Campbell as his concept of mythogenetic zones, which are large geographical areas in which a particular myth form crystallizes, such as the entire zone of southern France in the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine, wherein the Arthurian myths and legends were born. The concept also influenced Campbell's emphasis upon diffusion to explain the spread of particular motifs and ideas along a geographic route, such as the Old Silk Road, which extended from Cadiz, Spain to Shanghai, China, from 100 BCE to 100 CE. I have, by the way, capitulated to the BCE and CE designations, not as a capitulation to the left by any means at all, but as part of my process of de-Christianizing the West and getting rid of it. Campbell, as an American empiricist, strongly emphasized diffusion as a counter-concept to Jung's explanation for the similarity of mythological motifs, such as the virgin birth or the solar hero, as expressions of a collective unconscious. Although Campbell accepted Jung's explanation in cases in which he didn't think diffusion could account for the issue, such as the commonality of sand painting amongst both the Tibetan Buddhists and the Navajo Native Americans of the American Southwest, and then so on. And then so you read the note, and then go back up to where we were in the neighborhood here somewhere. Okay. My view from 1898 distinguishes between the morphology anatomy, and physiology of culture forms. It is therefore entirely scientific. Although it already classified culture as the third realm of organic and inorganic nature, its reasoning was still so thoroughly subject to the scientific observations of the time that it remained incapable of grasping the specific characteristics of the unique existence of individual cultures. Nevertheless, it represented progress. The birth of ethnology and cultural studies as the youngest child of modern science had only recently taken place. It emerged in a mechanistic period and was heavily burdened with semi-scientific preliminary work. Heinrich Schurz put it brilliantly. One could despair of the true value of work in this field. Everywhere capricious subjectivity interferes with the natural course of development. Everything fluctuates and shimmers in 1,000 colors. All rules are undermined by exceptions until finally the devastating realization sets in of never being able to attain even the smallest of fixed truths, which seems to be the only fruit of tireless labor, until the bitter feeling arises that it would be 100 times better to pursue some simple craft than to wrestle with this deceptive problem that slips through one's fingers. Given the nature of this subject matter, it was inevitable that two opposing views would initially compete for primacy: Bastion's, which based all cultural processes on the lawful functions of the human mind, and Ratzai's, which based all processes on geographical characteristics and the narrowness of human consciousness. Under these circumstances, the 1897 theory of culture circles was undoubtedly a step forward in that it contrasted culture as a subject with man as an object, and used the demarcation of its geographical extent as a means of recognizing morphological differences between species, while using age groups as a means of understanding physiognomic ways of life. But the theory of 1897 through 99 was heavily burdened, firstly by a technical error, a psychological idiosyncrasy, so to speak, and secondly, by a naive materialistic approach that was certainly contemporary. Both had their ultimate cause in the seclusion and isolation of its author at the time. I'm going to skip down here. Let's see. Okay. A few days before setting off on the first journey of the German Inner African Research Expedition, which I founded at that time, I realized that my teaching found fundamental recognition from others who had closely examined my working methods. But when my views were echoed by others, I became aware of the second weakness of that teaching from 1897 to 99, even if only in very general terms at first. Over the following years, however, I spent most of my time in contact with other peoples and people from other cultures, and in the long process of building up the archives into a research institute, I learned to place experience above knowledge. I had the opportunity to test the old way of thinking against countless examples and compare it with living facts. I came to know culture in all its magnificent and sometimes pitiful manifestations, but increasingly recognized human beings as the small bearers of the powerful world of cultural phenomena. And today I believe I know this second weakness from back then. The worldview from which it sprang was a mechanistic one. But organic life in the third kingdom, i.e. cultural life, is by its very nature accessible only to living intuition. Mechanistic and intuitive refer to two types of worldview. The mechanistic worldview seeks to understand the individual processes and phenomena of reality and spiritual life by establishing laws. Its strength lies in the identification of laws, its weakness in the creation of a contradiction that does not exist in the nature of the object, namely by arbitrarily contrasting the lawful with the unlawful, the normal with the abnormal, the rule with the exception. This separates the unlawful, the abnormal, and the exception into a second class, so to speak, and thus this view loses the ability to be comprehensive and at the same time to judge equally. The principle leads more quickly to a predetermined goal like a railroad track, but it makes free movement and observation of the larger picture impossible. In contrast, the intuitive worldview starts from the idea of a plan, contenting itself with finding the significant phenomena and understanding their place in the overall structure of existence. That is why intuition can maintain its unrestricted understanding of every change in reality. The mechanistic worldview sees before it a system of facts, which it breaks down into cause and effect, into elements and connections, and from which it derives supposedly universally valid relationships. It can and will only grasp life biologically or psychologically, namely by penetrating to protein or association processes, to affects, driving forces, ganglion cells, nerve substances, and then establishing rigid formulas. The intuitive researcher, on the other hand, seeks to experience the whole irregular realm of living spiritual impulses. He distinguishes the significant from the insignificant, the meaning of an expressive movement from its means. He immerses himself in the inner logic of all becoming, growing, and maturing, which cannot be grasped by experiment and system, and finds instead of rigid laws, types of living being and becoming. There's that becoming connection to Vernunft. Recall that from Goethe. And instead of formulas, symbolic events. By mechanism, I therefore mean the worldview that prevails today. And by intuition, I mean a worldview that has become rare today and is the exact opposite of the former. Mechanism and intuition are by no means meant here in the sense of philosophical teachings. Both mean something comprehensive, pervasive, almost compulsive, which dominates the general public as something essential. However, I would like to emphasize that the intuitive worldview should not be regarded as something new or even something correct. Certainly not new. Goethe's worldview was also thoroughly intuitive, but its impact was increasingly restricted under the influence of ever-growing specialization in the 19th century, so that he was quite right in saying that his works could never become popular, even if the whole world quotes Faust. And secondly, regarding what is right, all cultures have so far fluctuated in their worldview between the two poles of mechanism and intuition. But if I put forward the theory of the imminent beginning of a new cultural period, which cannot be proven, and this is going to be a crucial idea that influenced, in turn, Jean Gebser. So what we'll see here is that Leo Frobenius, in this book in particular, he has a lot of books. I intend on translating quite a few of them. He fills in the missing piece. He has a chart in the back of this book, just as both Gebser and Spengler have charts in the backs of their books. And this chart came as a reply to Spengler's chart. Then I went back and I checked all of Gebser's footnotes and realized that he has read Frobenius and metabolized him and gotten from this book in particular this idea of a third phase of human history, which then Gebser will simply call the integral consciousness structure. But he took it from Frobenius, as we'll see. But if I put forward the theory of the imminent beginning of a new cultural period, which cannot be proven systematically but can only be made certain intuitively, then I must encourage the first stirrings of reawakening intuition, especially since the first representatives of this view are sacrificed all the more successfully and unerringly the sooner they appear. It must also be emphasized that there can be neither an absolutely mechanistic nor an absolutely intuitive worldview. Rather, as was already stated at the beginning, it is a matter of a calibration line, of the predominance of one or the other tendency of view, or, to use two basic concepts of this writing, which will soon be explained in more detail, the primacy of the sense of fact or of the demonic in man. Now, I've capitalized these. The Germans capitalize all their nouns anyway, but not in English. But they need to be capitalized, as you'll see, because they're part of his three-stage model of human individual development, as well as cultural development, as well as the entire human species development goes through three stages. The only stage we haven't gone through is the third stage of human history as a totality. So that is the age in which facts and machines predominate. The demonic is the age of childhood, the childhood of man, which has indigenous societies and so forth. The pre-cultural period on Spengler's charts, that's the demonic period there, but he'll define it. The year 1904 took me out among other peoples into the sphere of African cultures. There began a life so rich and almost excessively blessed with experiences and impressions that I believe today I cannot be grateful enough. Times of free, unbound existence in which I was given the entire responsibility of leading an independent life for myself and many people entrusted to me, and in which scientific material, insights, and experiences flowed to me in unimagined abundance, alternated with corresponding intervals which were filled with diligent study at home and work on the ever-growing archive. The harvest I reaped was abundant. I will never be able to communicate it in its entirety to the world, but this made it all the more necessary to work on the collections and organize the manuscripts with great rigor. More and more helpers were needed both outside and at home. The small scholar's study of 1894 became a research institute, which now had to be managed and kept alive both at home and from the field of work over there. The experiences gained outside had to be compared with the newly arrived descriptions and with the information in the existing literature, and the museum material obtained elsewhere had to be taken into account. Boxes were replaced by cabinets, bookshelves were replaced by library rooms, the few points of view of the early days multiplied into hundreds, the staff grew steadily, the previously small work of the individual increasingly demanded a clarity that was accessible to all. The whole thing had become a large organism. It was inevitable that this development would also influence my views of 1895. However, after a few wide-ranging overviews, The Cultural Atlas and The Age of the Sun God, both 1904, I had limited myself to Africa and European prehistory. This book, by the way, The Age of the Sun God, had a huge influence on Carl Jung. He quotes from it all through his writings. But on the one hand, studying the cultures of the Red Continent and the constant change of the ice ages brought the typical and organic more to the fore than the special and unique. And on the other hand, the growing familiarity with that continent brought with it a sharper view of modern European culture forms, which had often not been experienced for a long time and were only seen from a distance. What's more, the distance between people and culture continued to grow. Over there, I saw great, strong culture forms among dark, little-noticed peoples, and in Europe, small and meager cultural remnants among great, high-ranking people, and vice versa. I saw broad and free ways of thinking, deep and inner spirituality, great and true poetry in gloomy corners of the world, and here right next to the significant, but also pettiness, envy, and everything else that Pandora's box once kept under lock and key, there are no better people here than there. So those of you on the left who have canceled Frobenius because of his intellectual colonialism need to take sentences like that into your account, but you don't, because you don't even sit down and read. These people don't read, any of these people. They don't read Spengler, they don't read Frobenius or Steiner or Gebser because their teachers tell them not to. And so what they're getting when you go to the university these days, you're not getting an education, you're getting an indoctrination into political principles of the left, who is filtering the knowledge through left stencils for you. It's a very impoverished, sickly, skeletal education that you're getting at the university. The question of the goodness of people is based on the wrong point of view, for except for a small number of characteristics inherited from culture, people are the same here as there, the same except for the form of culture. And in 1920, I must call this even more an independent organism than in 1895. Today, culture appears to me in its great organicity even more independent of man than it did then. I am confirmed in this view not only by my own experience, but also by the research of others, which has in the meantime come closer and closer to the teaching of 1895, until finally Oswald Spengler, in his first volume of The Decline of the West, which is the only one published so far, he's writing this in 1920, 2 years after it's been published, has arrived at the same result, in principle, by the same means. This work is also cultural or ethnic studies in the comprehensive sense of the word. Spengler, however, has only examined the authenticated part of history in terms of the meaning and essence of the cultural organism, i.e. those culture forms that belong to the ongoing period of formation and which I describe as monumental, which means the middle stage of his three-stage model, the monumental stage, the Hochkulturen. Spengler's achievement is an eminent one, but due to its limitations, it is incomplete both at the top and at the bottom, meaning that he left prehistory out of account and he has left post-history out of account. Frobenius sees us now as living in a post-historical age. That's his third phase of human history, the old age of humanity. Spengler's achievement is an eminent one, but due to its limitations, it is incomplete both at the top and at the bottom. Nevertheless, my teaching could hardly have found a more substantial collaborator, and there could hardly have been a more remarkable confirmation of the validity of that older view than his. He, too, assumes that cultures are living beings of the highest order. He, too, says cultures are organisms. He has involuntarily arrived at the terms of the 1895 doctrine. The big difference from back then, however, is that Spengler treats the subject intuitively and has thus continued along the path I had embarked upon in 1916 in my lecture Orient and Occident at the Asian Society in Berlin. Personally, I'm deeply grateful to him, as he gave me a lot of advice that benefited the terminology of this paper. What I have to say regarding Spengler in detail is mostly summarized in Chapter 2. Now, in the back of the book, that's footnote number 2, and my footnote number 2, I'm in the process of typing up the 2 letters that mark the end of their relationship, which lasted for 7 years. I'll read this. The friendship of Spengler and Frobenius lasted for just about 7 years, i.e. a quarter of a Saturn cycle, whereas Jung's relationship with Freud lasted for twice as long, about half of a Saturn cycle. It was about 13, 14 years. Frobenius was also 7 years older than Spengler. Here is the correspondence from 1927 documenting the end of their relationship. Spengler to Leo Frobenius, Munich, 8/1/1927, January 8th. While I most heartily reciprocate your New Year wishes, in particular for the Culture Morphological Institute, which will need good fortune in the coming years, I avail myself of the opportunity of your letter to explain quite openly the causes of my reserved attitude, and finally of my withdrawal from the board. This corresponds to that final exchange of letters between Freud and Jung when they're shouting at each other. Jung literally writes a letter loaded with exclamation marks as he's yelling at Freud. I think you will take a reasonable view, not though that because in this case, Frobenius was the older man by 7 years, he's not the all-star here. Spengler, though he's 7 years younger, is the all-star because Decline of the West hit Europe like a bolt out of the blue. It was a major bestseller and it catapulted Spengler to European celebrity overnight. So, if anything, Frobenius is in his shadow, not the other way around. I avail myself of the opportunity of your letter to explain quite openly the causes of withdrawal from the board. I think you will take a reasonable view of my motives, even if, as I fear, they affect you painfully. Since its foundation, I have always discriminated between the scientific and the business side. While I believed in the first, and never permitted myself a doubt about it, the second, in its adventurous character, went against my taste, which perhaps you will call middle class, but there it is. In my opinion, a learned institute that has to struggle for recognition should not be conducted in a Wild West style with a cheerful alternation between poverty and extravagance, which is quite in order for a hunting expedition. Wild West, that's his contempt for all things American and pop. However, it was not this kind of administration which occasioned my withdrawal. I decided on this when I was convinced that the journey to Egypt would take place. From your letter, I assumed that it was a question of excavating a pharaoh's grave, although the Egyptian government, as is known, only grants such concessions to professional Egyptologists. Then wide press publicity was given to the news that it was a question of unknown parts of the Sahara, or Arabia, Persia, and Turkestan, and that the expedition would last 1 or 2 years. Correction there. Plans which it was obvious from the start could not be carried out. It was suddenly clear that the real parties in the undertaking are a film publisher and a motor firm. I have nothing against film expeditions, but they should not be combined with scientific expeditions, and the auto caravan was announced all over the place. Meanwhile, the years became months, and the quarters of the earth became the tourist routes of Egypt. He's really grilling Frobenius here. And now I come to my strongest objection and completely assured results in a field which was at that time completely strange to me. Therefore, I have in every way supported it, both with the industrial benefactors and the professors who expressed serious doubts. In the meantime, I have slowly worked through the latest literature on prehistoric and ethnographical problems in order to establish the main lines of history back to the 6th millennium. See, he's working on Frühzeit der Weltgeschichte at this point, the dawn of world history, which reading Paideuma awakened him to the fact that he had completely missed all the forms of the Neolithic and the Paleolithic. So that book, which I will be translating after I'm finished translating Primordial Questions, in fact, both books are the direct result of his encounter here with Frobenius, and have recognized, the 6th millennium, and have recognized in an increasing degree the uncertainty of the constructions and the works of the Research Institute. Here the basic mistake of the culture circle theory has avenged itself, that of neglecting absolute chronology and regarding later or earlier as the same as late and early. Although, for example, the relatively earliest in Central Africa is much later than the latest in Egypt. I've been wanting to tell you this by word of mouth for a long time because in the short space of a letter it sounds more severe than is intended. Frobenius to Spengler. February 24th, 27. It took him a full month and a half, almost 2 months, to respond to that. As you have been informed by the office, as the result of perpetual cases of influenza in our office, only the day-to-day business could be carried out, and we were not in a position to put up a document adequate to serve as an answer to your letter of 8/1 as quickly as I should have liked. You may be sure that it is the same with me as it is with you, when you say that you have no occasion for resentment, if views, however opposed they may be, are put forward against your own works by a responsible personality. I can assure you that neither a film company nor a motor firm had any share in the expedition. The 6 cars were duly paid for and all propaganda were a priori refused. The film people made a harmless culture film of the Nile, but paid the expenses, about 13,000 marks, out of their own pockets. Your statements astound me even more when you say that the expedition traveled only on routes permitted to tourists. Pardon me, and do not be offended when I tell you that this statement is incomprehensible in a man of learning, and frivolous in the case of anyone else. As has been stated in the press, I can tell you that our motorized expedition traveled through extremely important parts of the Nubian desert, which have never been reached by a tourist, nor even by the Egyptian Survey Department, and through parts which have never been trodden by an explorer. You write, since Schweinfurt saw the rock drawings in the area in question, and extensive literature has appeared, so I do not know what there was new to see. In answer to this, I can tell you that our honored friend Schweinfurt, shortly before his death, left it to me as I had described the West African pictorial, and so on. It gets into other details, but that's the funny part of the letter. Spengler accusing him of being a showman, basically, instead of a scientist. In a way, Spengler canceling Frobenius. It's pretty funny stuff, but they have deep karmic connections, and we'll look at those in a moment. Next, I want to look at his chart, his equivalent here to Spengler's chart. It's only a one-page chart, but it's powerful. And Gebser's chart, and it's called the Fundamentals of Paideuma. And so we have stages, the first stage, second stage, third stage, that correspond to the age groups of the child, adolescent, and the old man. A. Paideuma of the individual. Forms and essence. For the child, first stage, demonic. For the middle stage, adolescent, idealistic. And for the old man, third stage, factical. Thought forms. Soulful for the first stage. Vernunft, that's the reason that is applied to creative forms. Verstand, the scientific understanding. Phenomena are fundamentally creative at first. This corresponds to the springtime in Spengler's world, or just before it. Individuality. The individual is discovered and dissociates himself from the group at this point in the shift from tribalism to the high cultures. There is a shift in the relationship of the individual to the group. And rationality for the third phase. Character is spontaneity for the first phase, like children are. Duality, the duality between self and world, between I and the other. Notice how closely that comes to the same phase in Gebser's model, the mythological consciousness structure in which the self, the micro-self, the Atman, is distinguished from the over-self, the Brahman, the oversoul, in that stage. It is very clear to me that Gebser has read this and has borrowed from it quite a bit. Basically, what Gebser has done is to synthesize Spengler, Frobenius, and Carl Jung. He's pulling all of them together into one synthesis, which is essentially a complete worldview, except it's missing Rudolf Steiner on the one hand, with karma and reincarnation, and astrology on the other. Although, since Jung embraced astrology, we can say that Frobenius and Gebser and Spengler missed the boat on astrology. They all dismissed it. So then and characters, spontaneity, duality, and resolution. B, then on the macro stage, the Paideuma of social formations, forms and periods. Culture stages, barbarism at first, then he's got this term cultural egg for the creation of high cultural forms, and then mechanics, periods, creation, cultural forms, and then fulfillment. Paideuma of social formations, morphology of epochs. Phenomena, one-tiered, birth of the demonic. That's essentially with the one-tiered means that there's only one in indigenous societies, tribal societies, there's only one tier. They have not differentiated a cultural elite from the pop culture. Frobenius makes a distinction between high culture and pop culture as forming the duality, which is basic to the internal anatomical structure of the high cultures. Two-tiered, then, development of the idea. That's the two tiers that I just sketched out. And then three-tiered now for this coming world age here. This is the coming world age. This is where Gebser took his integral consciousness structure right from this. Three-tiered is composed of a harmonious interlocking of the demonic, i.e. the magical consciousness structure, the idealistic, i.e. the mythological consciousness structure, and factical, i.e. the mental consciousness structure. It's basically the same idea. It's the integral consciousness structure because the integral is an harmonious interlocking of the magical, mythical, and mental consciousness structures. That's what it is. Character, primitive for the first phase, monumental for high cultures, and then he's calling this coming culture phenomenal, which he says will be a global planetary culture for the first time. Spatiality starts with clans, then you have the formation of a people with the high civilizations, and the ecumeny for this coming third phase, the global. Ecumeny means universal, it's global. And the type of temporality, note this. First phase, ahistorical. Second, historical, and now timeless. We are outside of history, he says in this book now. All the civilizations have done individually, geographically, what they were meant to do, and now it's all about a harmony, a cultural interchange. This is why the West is just totally, all this is flying right over their heads. They're not getting any of this at all. And so now let's have some fun with astrology with these guys here. Let's see what we got. Bring this over here. And let's see. So this is Spengler's chart right here. And note that he's got a cluster of planets sitting right on his descendant. The descendant is your part of your social axis. The ascendant is your ego. The descendant is you one-on-one in relation with other people. And he has Pluto there, which is essentially the id, but it's a lot more than the id. Freud also has Pluto there as well, perfectly placed for a psychoanalyst. And Venus as well also. Venus and Pluto together tend to produce individuals whose sexuality is not vanilla, let's say. And from interviewing him with a medium, I got the impression that Spengler was probably a closet homosexual. That would not surprise me one bit. And then we have here, not that there's anything wrong with that, I'm just saying that corresponding to the archetypes. Mercury conjunct Sun, very, very powerful intellect. When you put Mercury together with Pluto, you've got someone who wants to get to the bottom of things and loves beautiful thoughts. Venus has to do with beauty. That's his sophistication regarding art forms there. And he's got Uranus up here near his midheaven, which is that's your professional career axis, the persona that you show to the outer world. With your highest planet there, that's sort of your telos, your guiding telos, and Uranus is the planet of breakthrough and innovation. And when it is paired, as it is here, in a 90-degree square with the sun, it very often corresponds to genius. Very many geniuses have that. Maybe not all of them, and maybe not people who do have that aspect might not be geniuses, but it's more often the case than not that you get Uranus and the sun together with geniuses. He's got Neptune down there in that stellium 2. Neptune rules the imagination and all things astral, archetypal, collective unconscious, astral plane, all that kind of stuff. And then he's got Saturn down here, which is in a square with Mars. That's a fascination with antiques and old things. Saturn is the planet of the past, karma, the old man, the cranky old man. Jupiter with the optimistic king, you might say. And that's also squaring the Mars. So there's a lot of energy. Mars is energy. So let's take a look here at Frobenius' chart. We don't have his birth time, so we don't have the 4 angles. But we can see over here we've got Pluto conjunct his north node, conjunct Venus. Your nodes have to do with your karma. The south node over here is past life karma. And this time, north node is the goal, the telos that you're aiming for this time. And it's connected with power. And this is indeed a man who's, you can tell from the interchanges and so forth, that this guy wants to be in control of things. He wants to run the show. He wants to be the director on the set. That may have been part of the power conflict between him and Spengler, but watch what happens when we put their charts together in what's called a synastry reading, which is a combination of the charts. And so he has Neptune over here, opposite Mars, lots of power for the imagination, and then Saturn in opposition to both Mercury. He has Mercury conjunct Uranus instead of Uranus and the Sun, but he's got, that's the breakthrough mind in opposition to Saturn, which has to do with rigor, discipline, and form. He's trying to do, he's the rebel, and Uranus is the planet of rebellion, and he's a rebel, but he has to contend with the authorities, with the scientific establishment. So there's a power pull there, a back and forth tug of war between the discipline of the sciences and his breakthrough, innovative, rare, and unusual way of approaching culture forms with Jupiter, Moon, and so forth. Okay, so let's look at their compatibility, or rather, a synastry is where you put two charts, synthesize them together, and you see where the connections are. And you can tell by the connections that there's karma. In this case, look at this is, let's see, what color was Frobenius? I had him as orange, I think. And Spengler as, let me go back and double check. Yeah, okay. Spengler's in blue. Okay, so the inner wheel blue is all of Spengler, and the outer wheel is Frobenius. So let's just start over here. Spengler's Uranus is conjunct Frobenius's Lilith. Over here, his part of fortune is right near his Frobenius's Uranus, and Mars against his Mercury. That's intellectual contentiousness. This is the two going back and forth through those letters. They probably have a lot more that are existing somewhere where they're debating and so forth. And then Frobenius' Sun is sitting on his vertex and his nodes. That's karma right there. The nodes have to do with karma. So does the vertex, because the vertex has to do with fated encounters. So it has to do with karma too. And this man Spengler was going to have a fated encounter with Leo Frobenius. That's his ego right here. And then over here we've got the really interesting, this is the meat right here. Frobenius also has Pluto conjunct Venus, and they are conjunct Spengler's Pluto conjunct Venus. That's interesting. Right on Spengler's one-on-one social axis there. And the nodes, Frobenius's nodes are conjunct, just as Spengler's nodes were conjunct Frobenius's Sun, Frobenius's nodes are conjunct Spengler's. That's a major karmic tangle there. And then over here we've got Frobenius's Neptune on his Saturn. So yeah, these are karmic ties. When you get charts that do this, it's not random. There's nothing in the universe that's random. No matter what the deconstructionists say, no matter what the atheist materialists say, they are totally, completely, 100% wrong. They are walking with their heads up their asses. And so let's take a look at their transits for when they broke up. This is just as interesting as the transits are for Freud and Jung, because Freud and Jung had Sun, Moon conjunct at 1516 Taurus. And as they were breaking up after about 13 years, Saturn was transiting right through them. Saturn has that sickle, remember, and Saturn likes to cut the ties. Okay, so let's take a look. Where is Saturn? This is the first thing that leapt out. I can find it. Let's see here. Where was that? So we have Jupiter conjunct Moon. And the nodes, look at that. Both nodes were conjunct. They were like tangled up together with each other. And then, yeah, they're right on the whole, the nodes. The nodes they're the only thing that goes clockwise. And the moon's nodes are simply the 2 points where it intersects the zodiac, the north point and the south point. And it takes about 19 years for them to come around. That's called a metonic cycle, where the sun and moon come back together and there are eclipses involved. That's what the Odyssey is about. It's 19 years that Odysseus has been away from Penelope. Somebody knew some astrology there. And let's see, they've got Mars, and Frobenius's Mars conjunct Spengler's Neptune, which suggests some aggression towards Spengler's imagination from Frobenius there. Maybe some resentment. And Chiron is the planet of trauma, wounds, and healing. And here it is conjunct 27 degrees, still conjunct 24 degrees Saturn. So it suggests there's a wound there, that the two of them are supposed to heal karmically. Saturn, again, has that sickle and can inflict wounds. And then, all right, yeah, so that's the chart of their breakup, I think. And then, or is this one? 1873. I think this is the chart of their actual breakup. I can't remember. I did this morning. Um, all right, well, we'll leave it there. I'll have to do some more research on this and sit down with it. Um, but it's pretty fascinating stuff, astrology. The all the connections here, in the synastry chart and the transit chart. I did 2 transits. One for May 29th. That's the birth date. Birth date. Doesn't say what the date of the transit is. Um, okay, we'll leave it there. But that's so I've completed Paideuma. The translation's done, 100%. And it's the first book I've ever translated. So I'm glad I have my German back. And that's Leo Frobenius. And I will be translating more. I'm going to put out Paideuma in a couple of weeks, however long it takes me to go through it and put in my own comments. I want to have a very rich commentary in the back of the book. Since it's only 125 pages, it could use another 50 pages of text to bring it in at 200. And it will be put out in hardcover and also in paperback. It shouldn't be too expensive because there won't be very many color images, just a few that are necessary when he starts talking about architecture. So it should be fairly cheap. I doubt that it will be any more than $39 for a hardcover. So then we'll leave it at that. That's Paideuma, Leo Frobenius.